Welcome to our Start Something series. We are excited to continue with the second event, which features in-depth conversations from some of the most successful entrepreneurs, innovators, and leaders in the Seattle's innovation ecosystem. My name is Ashley Esteban, and I am the director of Commotion Labs. Commotion Labs is a multi-industry incubator with facilities and programs to support startups in the life sciences, hardware, and technology domains. Two of our incubators are in Fluke Hall, and our technology incubator, also known as Startup Hall, is where we are today. Across all three of the incubators, we support startups from both inside and outside the University of Washington. This evening, I'm very honored to welcome David Baker to our space, director of the University of Washington Institute of Protein Design, and Jenny Cronin, who is the principal at AI2 Incubator. Jenny will interview David about the impact of AI on life sciences and healthcare startups. More on these two in a minute, but one last thing, if you are going to be posting pictures on social media, please hashtag them with our hashtag #StartSomething. I'd like to introduce now David Chi from Exceeder, who is our sponsor for tonight's event.
First of all, thanks for joining us tonight. My name is John Chi. I'm co-founder and CEO of Exceeder. We're a lab equipment leasing company, and we're the sponsor of tonight's event. So just want to take a moment to express my gratitude for all of you being here, and also a special shout out to CoMotion for your inspiring mission to help transform all of your innovative ideas into positive economic and societal impact. CoMotion's dedication to fostering innovation to drive positive change truly resonates with me. We founded Exceeder about 13 years ago. It spun out of the labs at UC Berkeley with a similar mission. So it brings me a lot of joy to see and witness the collaborative, creative, supportive environment that CoMotion has fostered in collaboration with UW. On a similar note, I also wanted to just give a quick mention to the podcast that we launched March of last year called the Biotech Startups Podcast. You kind of see the swag table in the back. Yeah, our podcast mission is to demystify scientific entrepreneurship by having candid, long-form conversations with leaders in the industry. We currently release episodes weekly, and actually just dropped an episode today with Martin Brenner from iBio, who is the CEO and CSO of iBio. iBio is a publicly traded drug discovery company that also utilizes AI to develop safer and more effective immunotherapies for difficult to treat cancers. They partner with the likes of Eli Lilly, the NIH, and other notable institutions as well. So we have conversations with leaders like Martin about their personal and entrepreneurial journeys and digging into what it takes to run a biotech company. So if you want to check it out, head over to the merch table. Obviously not right now, afterwards. And then, there's scannable QR links. So if you want to check out an episode, I encourage you to do so. But yeah, thanks again for everyone joining us tonight. And thank you, Ashley, Karen, David, Jenny, for putting this wonderful event together. We really appreciate it. And please enjoy the rest of your evening. And if you're working on a startup and need equipment, give us a shout. We'd love the opportunity to lend a hand. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, John and Exceeder. We couldn't do it without your support. I'd now like to welcome Jenny and David to the front of the room. So I'm first going to introduce Jenny, and then she'll go ahead and introduce David after that. Jenny is an investor at AI2 Incubator, a pre-seed startup incubator here in Seattle, where she focuses on startups at the intersection of AI and biotech or healthcare. Prior to joining AI2, Jenny was a product manager at NanoString, leading their GeoMix digital spatial profiler antibody portfolio, and a science communication advisor at a boutique PR firm working with early-stage biotech clients. Jenny received her PhD at the University of Washington in Bioengineering with research on brain-computer interfaces for touch restoration. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. David, thank you for being with us this evening. So David Baker is the director of the Institute for Protein Design, a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator, a professor of biochemistry, and an adjunct professor of genome sciences, bioengineering, chemical engineering, computer science, and physics here at the University of Washington. His research group is focused on the design of macromolecular structures and functions. Dr. Baker has published over 600 research papers, has been granted over 100 patents, and co-founded 17 companies. Over 70 of his mentees have gone on to independent faculty positions. Okay, let me open up these questions. But David, again, thank you for being with us this evening. I'd love to start at the beginning and just hear a little bit about the journey that led you to doing protein design and to the University of Washington.
Long journey, and I didn't really plan most of it. And in fact, I tell my students and just not to plan too far ahead because you never know where life is going to take you. I actually grew up in Seattle. I went to Garfield High School. I left Seattle for about 14 years. Came back as an assistant professor, long time ago, and protein design was not really on my radar. We started off working on trying to understand how proteins fold, and after we were thinking about how proteins fold, and we got some idea about how that might work, and then we thought, well, if we understand how proteins fold, maybe we can predict the structure of a protein from its sequence. And we made some progress on that, and then we thought, well, maybe we could go backwards and design new sequences that will fold up to new structures. And our first success really in making brand new proteins was 20 years ago. It's kind of crazy. And at that point, it seemed totally crazy. Like all the proteins that the world knew about were things that came through, natural evolution. And, they have these amazing names like, all the names that biologists made up for proteins like hunchback and frazzled and whatever. So we can now make these new proteins on the computer that didn't have that. So it was like, rather than like having the elfin runes from the past being passed down, which is the way that modern proteins are, we can make new ones. And really, since then, after we could make new proteins, then we were like, aha, well, maybe we can make new proteins do useful things. And that is sort of what we've been working on since then.
Thank you. So I'm curious, and this is kind of going back to the journey question. Did you always imagine being a researcher and an entrepreneur? Were either of those part of the original, like your thoughts early on?
No, not at all. I mean, I would say my major in college was social studies, and which actually turns out to have been more relevant than I would have guessed, having a not very small lab now. And then I went to graduate school. I discovered I liked it. I came here and had fun as a professor, but I really was not thinking about starting companies at all. If I talked about starting companies, everyone would have just laughed and run in the other direction. I mean, protein folding was about as far from anything commercial that anyone could imagine. And when we first started designing proteins, I think the general consensus is that this could just never be useful. So I think being an entrepreneur and starting companies really grew out of the work that we were doing, and so it sort of led me to everything that then happened later. But it wasn't really intentionally planned.
Yeah. Fantastic. I'll have lots of questions about startups shortly, but first, I'd love to hear, in the time that you've been working on this, the space has evolved a lot, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how computational advances and AI specifically has impacted your work.
Yeah. So there's been a huge transformation of computing generally, and then obviously deep learning AI more recently. So as far as computing goes, proteins are very complicated molecules, and so you need a lot of computer power to model them, whether you're using traditional sort of physically based approaches or deep learning approaches. And so our methods, and you also need models like computer models that have enough accuracy to do things like predict protein structure or design new proteins. So for many years, we developed sort of physically based models of protein folding and protein design. We were modeling all the atoms in the system, and we did that with a program called Rosetta, which sort of became the industry standard. You know, people one thing that I really believed in from the beginning is that we should share everything that we did. And so when people came to my group and developed something, they all contributed to this Rosetta program, and then we just made that available really around the world. So everyone started using it. And that was an important lesson maybe we can get back to later, just thinking about software. But then about 5 years ago, as deep learning started coming on the scene, we realized that we needed to become expert in deep learning. And it actually was, it was interesting because we went from not really having doing much in deep learning to being one of the more intensive places where deep learning was doing in academia in a relatively short time. And people often ask me how that could happen. And I think the answer was that, we really understood the problem. And so it was just another sort of tool we could use. So it was pretty easy to take all the things that we had thought about and tried to do with the physical models and sort of translate those into deep learning models. And then since then, the deep learning models have just gotten more and more powerful. So the complexity of what we can build has gotten greater and greater.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. When you're thinking about staying at the cutting edge of AI and following what those advances are so that you can pull it into your own work, how does that impact bringing new grad students into the lab? Do many of them have both computational and wet lab experience? Do some have just one? How do you gauge bringing those students in so that you have the skill sets needed?
Yeah, well, there's a big diversity of backgrounds. And I think I'm an adjunct professor in many different departments. So the more biologically related students won't have done any much software development, whereas computer science graduate students may have done quite a lot. And so I do get into situations where the computer science graduate students don't really approve of the computer code that the non-computer scientists write. Now, being one of the non-computer scientists, but I think it works out well because most of what we do involves, we're using computation to design new proteins, and then we go to the lab to test them. So every quarter, the University of Washington, there are rotations, and so students come in for a rotation from many different departments, and generally there's some that have a lot of experience in the lab, but none on the computer, and some who are the opposite. And basically they help each other out. So we have cohorts where people are figuring out what one who can answer any question. And I think it's true also for the group as a whole. Some people are really expert in one area, some people are really expert in another area.
Yeah. You made a point that I actually wanted to touch on, which is we talked about some of the computational advances that have pushed your work forward, but it hasn't just been computational advances, correct? There's also been assay and chemistry advances that have pushed things forward, like being able to test a protein quite quickly.
Yeah, that's been really important, and that's kind of the unsung hero of some of the advances we've made recently, where where it's all the deep learning stuff that gets the central billing, but in fact, in parallel with that, some extremely brilliant people in the lab developed very, very rapid ways of making and then testing hundreds of proteins all at the same time. And so when we developed the next generation of deep learning methods, we could test them out on a scale that never would have been possible before. So it's really the combination of developing methods both on the computational side and then on the lab side that is really pushing this forward.
Yeah, it seems to me that you really need both of those. If you just
really
had
do.
the AI advances, you would be then bottlenecked by the wet lab side of it and being able to test things.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I think everybody knows that DeepMind made this tremendous breakthrough with AlphaFold in structure prediction. And from the earliest time after, when it was clear they were working on structure prediction, they said they were working on protein design as well. And in fact, when AlphaFold, the breakthrough, was announced, there were many of my academic colleagues who said it was all gloom and doom because the tech companies were going to own the space. But we instead thought it was really inspiring, and that was, that accelerated our dive into deep learning. And in fact, DeepMind hasn't released anything on protein design, whereas we and others have made all these breakthroughs. So I think you really need both, and I think that's hard for a tech company to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about deep learning as an advancement. It was the summer of 2021, I think, when Rosetta Fold and AlphaFold 2 were released. They had been announced previously.
Yeah.
But since then, I think, as we all know, there's been a lot of computational AI advances. So I'd love to hear, just in the past couple of years, like, what are you really excited about? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot of development. So AlphaFold and Rosetta Fold predict the structures of proteins from their sequences, but in biology, proteins don't work alone. They work with small molecules, they bind to DNA, they get modified in various ways. So proteins are just part of biomolecular systems. And so that hasn't been possible to model with AlphaFold or Rosetta Fold. But actually in the March 7th Science, which I think is next week, the big hit splash is going to be, we now have generalized Rosetta Fold to model arbitrary biomolecular systems. And we can use that not only to model them, but we can also use that to design them. So that's one of the exciting breakthroughs. I would say other things are just really figuring out how to use sort of the deep learning, sort of some of the deep learning concepts that were in AlphaFold and Rosetta Fold to actually design proteins, because that wasn't obvious at the time those papers came out.
Fantastic, thank you. I want to go back to this conversation around how your lab and your students pool in new AI methods, and use a specific example, which I just think is exciting because of its relation to image generation, which folks might be more familiar with. So my understanding is you have to release the RF diffusion model, which is a model, a diffusion-based model, so it's much like models that are behind some image generation generators like DALL-E. So I'd love to just, if we can use that as a specific example, like how do your students take this, diffusion models are being developed and the computer scientists are writing about them, and then pull that work to developing protein structures?
Well, I think the answer is, and this is, I think, again, the advantage that we have over DeepMind, for example, is, we're at the University of Washington, a great public institution, and we're just incredibly open. So we have visitors coming through all the time, and whether they're a venture capitalist or someone from a pharma company or a visiting student, we all, they can see everything we're doing all the time. And so we have students visiting from various places, and they often bring in ideas, and so that's one place that things come from. In the case of RF diffusion, there was a very talented visiting student who wanted to come for 6 months, and he started to play with diffusion models, and then other ways it happens is there's there now is a very strong deep learning sort of group in my lab, and they're always looking through recent papers all the time, and then there are a lot of people want to collaborate and visit. So I think just by being open and like having people to come here, and then people go to meetings. So it's I think another disadvantage that a tech company has is tech companies are really good at what they do, but by being a closed environment, it's hard to innovate on sort of broadly.
And for students, if there's ones here or listening online, your lab is clearly very interdisciplinary and collaborative. And I think that overall that's true for academic settings, that labs are more collaborative and less siloed. But if for students who feel like they're sitting in a less collaborative lab, do you have suggestions for how they reach out and make those connections?
Yeah, I think collaboration is just absolutely central to science, and I just encourage my students just to email people. If they're working on a problem, I say figure out who the best 3 people are in the world and email them. And sometimes you won't get an answer, but other times you will, and that could start a connection which could really transform your research.
Fantastic. So we talked about the paper that's going to be coming out next week. I'd love to hear what you think, how advances in AI and the protein design space, what are some of the grand challenges? If we flip it and describe it as the challenges we are poised to solve, what would you say are the big top 3?
Yeah. Well, one of in the pharmaceutical industry for protein therapeutics, antibodies are really the key molecules, and deep learning methods are, so right now the way you make an antibody to something is you immunize an animal, or you screen a library of, of a huge random library, or a library that represents all of the human repertoire. But we can now design antibodies on the computer and using RF diffusion, basically. And I think, and there are many groups working on this, so I think we're going to see a transition from protein therapeutics being obtained by kind of black magic, like immunizing an animal and letting the natural immune system come up with a solution, to actually being designed rationally. And that will be important because you can put more in, as you learn more and more, you can put more in about, it's not just about binding the target, but you have to be able to produce the antibody, and it has to be safe, and it has to be a good drug molecule. And so rational methods like deep learning methods should in the long run be able to create not only antibodies that bind the target just as you want, but also ones that will be developable and safe and all that. And then going beyond antibodies, which are really blunt instruments, if you take an antibody for for autoimmune disease or anything, it's, it just basically, it goes there and blocks some process. But what you'd really like are smarter therapeutics that can actually kind of do calculations in the body and be responsive and only act in the right place and not other places. And I think that's going to become increasingly possible as protein design methods become more powerful.
Fantastic. So those are both therapeutics spaces. Yes. I'm curious to hear about non-therapeutics areas. So it's my understanding that the IPD does do some research in spaces where protein design could be really impactful, but outside of what we think of as traditional therapeutics, yet proteins are still active there.
Right. Well, if you look in biology, proteins capture energy from the sun and use it to make molecules, and so photosynthesis is really a fascinating process, and we're working on basically artificial photosynthetic systems now, ones that will capture light, solar energy, and use it to do things. So that's one area. Another things that proteins do very effectively is mineralization. So our bones, teeth, shells, it's all proteins and biological stuff interacting with inorganic minerals. And so I think that's a very exciting area, both for carbon fixation, but then making new types of materials. So we've recently figured out how to design proteins that lead to zinc oxide nucleation, which we're very excited about. And then enzymes for sustainability, are filling up the world with plastic. So, catalysts that can break down pollutants and so forth. Those are just some of the examples of the use of proteins outside therapeutics. I think for diagnostics, one of the things that another area we're very excited about is being able to design nanopores that have basically completely controllable size and interiors. And I think that the applications of those are huge. So Oxford Nanopore is a big company that does single molecule DNA sequencing. It's basically based on one naturally occurring pore. But now we can create hundreds of different pores from scratch with all different properties. So I think that's another, thinking about molecular noses or protein sequencing and things.
And I know this is incredibly hard to do, but if you were to try to, on a scale, say how close is that to like really early basic research versus commercialization, nearing commercialization, where would you put it?
Well, which?
Well, we could go through each one of them, but let's use enzymes as a starting point.
Yeah.
Enzymes to break down, let's say, waste and plastic materials.
Ingrid, who is here, started a company. Ingrid, how many years ago now? Yeah, on a designed enzyme, and it was an incredibly successful company for breaking down for celiac disease, and she sold the company to Takeda a number of years ago, and is now thinking on her, I don't know what number of company, but involved in a lot of different things. So enzymes, enzyme, yeah,
not just
it's happened.
Yes,
it's happened already.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, certainly not just applied to the environmental waste space.
But so I think in the environmental space, that's a good question. So what will be the first company? It's a little bit hard to say. I mean, things often go from being a pie in the sky idea to something that is eminently commercializable very quickly. So I'll give you an example. we're trying to marry proteins with electronics. So to design nanopores that will insert into drilled holes in silicon nitride. And that's been hard, but I think once that works, there will be huge, I mean, that will be able to translate quite quickly. So I think I think catalysts are the same way. You know, if you create a catalyst that degrades something which is, you know, we can think about plastic or other things. I think once you have a very highly functional protein, the path from there to translating can be shorter than you think.
Is there a commonality in what often takes your lab from that pie in the sky to something that's working and close to commercialization? Is it often a computational bottleneck that's solved? Is it often something else?
Well, it's a combination of things. It's basically everything getting better that lets us solve harder problems. Like you pointed out before, it's not just the computational parts, but it's also the experimental parts. So coming up with, say, an enzyme for a really high-value reaction, it's better design methods so that you can get closer to the ideal catalyst. But it's also better experimental methods, so you could screen more different designs and figure out which ones were the best ones quickly. So it's a combination of things.
Okay. I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk about starting companies. This is the Start Something series.
Yeah.
So you've co-founded 17 companies, 9 of which are IPD spinouts. Can you tell us the story of your first startup and what made you and students, co-founders, take that leap?
Let's see. Well, the first one was a long time ago. It wasn't really an IPD company. Well, Ingrid's company was really one of the first ones, PVP. And I think the key for starting a company is a really brilliant, highly dedicated person like Ingrid, who, as a graduate student, you know, she worked with another student who was in my group, Justin Siegel, and they had this idea, and then we have a program at the IPD, this translational investigator program, which you know, after you finish your PhD, you can stay on for a year or two afterwards and really develop what you've generated and make it better and better. Actually, Ingrid's case was really interesting because it started off as an undergraduate project, an iGEM project. So it was.
I didn't realize that. And
Ingrid was the mentor, and she had this idea about, you know, what would be a cool thing to do. And so the students got to a certain point, and then Ingrid spent. How long was it, Ingrid? Was it 2 years? Yeah, in the program.
2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years in the program, really focusing on taking something that was pretty early to something that could be a product, and then at that point it was advanced enough for you know, for a company to really be interested and, you know, and help fund a company, a startup. So I think that's pretty much the general rule, that it's not just the innovations, and it's just as importantly, it's the people, or the person, or a couple. Often the founders of the companies from my lab are, you know, it's 2 or 3 people, and it's different in different cases. But those are the people who really drive it, and you know, it will go way beyond anything that was developed in my lab. So it's really about the people. So I think, you know, for the IPD, I kind of view it as we're attracting these really brilliant, highly motivated people from all over the world, and some fraction of them really like living in Seattle and want to stay here. And one way to do that is to start companies. So that's a really important ingredient.
Yeah, wonderful. Do you do anything at the IBD to try to encourage that collaboration and encourage entrepreneurial thinking?
Yeah, I think, well, you know, I think Ingrid's example and the examples of others like her are in motivation enough. So
yes. Yeah, that's true.
So Ingrid and others who have been successful in starting companies will come back to the IPD. We have happy hours. They give advice, and so sort of would-be entrepreneurs can talk to them and get inspiration. But people also just know what's happened before, and they're excited. I think the important thing about building collaborations, that's one of the things that my job is really important, just to make sure that people are always talking to each other, encourage people to form teams if they're interested in starting a company, to work together towards that. So yeah, really not sort of having this image of just you got to do it by yourself.
And are there folks around the IPD to help them assess commercial potential?
Oh, yes. So my colleague Lance Stewart, who was for many years the director of strategy at the IPD and now is in the head of IPD special operations, who many of you know Lance, that was one of his major roles, was to help, and it's still a role, to help advise people starting companies. And the new executive director of the IPD, Linda Stewart, is also very knowledgeable about translation, and we're actually now under her sort of leadership scaling up translation efforts at the IPD. So there are people to talk to, and then there's also all the people who left the IPD to start companies. We have happy hours Monday and Friday afternoon, and almost every one of these, there's several people who are from spin-outs or maybe on their second one who come, and they're just there to talk to people. And so, yeah.
So for folks outside of the IPD, do you have any suggestions for the types of people or profiles of folks they should be reaching out to and talking to assess the commercial potential for their own ideas?
Yes, well, I think that's one of the things that Commotion provides. Links to people who have been companies in Seattle. But I think obviously it's easier to talk to people who are here. So it's the same thing, like I said, on the science side. Reach out to people who've started companies or are at companies who are in the space you're in, and just talk to them. I think almost everyone is willing to help if you ask them. So.
Yeah. Do you think when you and students are choosing projects, how much do you balance commercial potential with interesting scientific research?
Well, for me, starting projects, the key thing is there has to be a really important unsolved problem that should be solvable in the next couple years of a smart student working on it.
Do it within your PhD.
Yeah. So that's a real art, though, to find those problems. And because you can't pick something that's too easy, because you spend your 5 years in PhD and nothing new is learned. I mean, you can write a paper, but it's not that you haven't really pushed the envelope. And if you choose a problem that's way too hard, then you won't get anywhere either. But in this, if you choose the right problems that are it is the time to solve them. This is the time to solve them. Then you solve them. And I think a surprisingly large fraction of the important unsolved problems, which that if you solve them, that there will be some commercial potential, maybe in a way that you didn't anticipate. And that certainly happened with a lot of the things we've done. So we worked for a long time on how to design protein beta barrels and then solve that problem. And then at that point, it was like, well, let's make beta barrel nanopores. And, so that, yeah. So.
Fantastic. Love to hear how is the translational investigator program funded?
Yeah, so that was funded initially and that was sort of how my first experience with fundraising. There was the Life Sciences Discovery Fund, LSDF, which I think came from tobacco money, the state, and they had a matching grant, and you had to raise matching funds. I think you had to raise four times more money than they were going to give you, and so we got a grant for that. So we were able to, and then that was where I met some people who were very good friends and continued supporters of the IPD, and then so that funded it initially, and then since then it's been largely philanthropy.
Fantastic. Can we talk a little bit about how you know it's the right time to spin an idea out?
Well, there's both sort of the internal and the external measures of that. Internally, I mean, we now know that if you spin out a company, you are now, an academic group is kind of a safe space, right?
Yes.
When you go out and you start a company, you're kind of on the line. You'll raise money probably, and then you have to produce something of value or clear steps towards it, within a year and a half. And so we make a call about whether we think something is at that point where it will be successful, because we don't want to spin out companies too early that may spin out and then spend a year or two looking for funding. I mean, that's just not effective. So that's our internal metric. And then there's the external one of, if there's venture capitalists coming through the IPD all the time. And so there's always this matchmaking going on. if you get traction with a firm that VC firm that you like, and they want to make an investment, then you know it's time in a way. If you tell your idea to everybody and who comes through and there's no interest, then, so we get both there's both an internal and external measure of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned VC funding, and most of the spinouts have been, I guess all have been significantly backed by venture groups. But Arzeda, which is one of the earliest, that might have been right before PVP.
Yeah, that's right.
They actually bootstrapped largely in the early days, right? I think for almost 10 years, not quite, and then more recently raised about a 33 million Series B. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that path. That was the non-early venture funding path. Yeah,
well, that's a really interesting case, and I'm glad you brought it up. So Arzeda is not making therapeutics.
Right.
Right. And so, and that's another great example of a company that, so it's outside of the therapeutics medicine space. And there were 3 brilliant people, 2 postdocs and a graduate student, who had this idea of starting the company, and they were able to make partnerships with initially agricultural companies and now a broader range of companies that really enable them to build the company before they actually took VC funding. And I think it's a really exciting company because they've had the time, they've developed technology both on the computational side and on the experimental side. And so I think there is an advantage. I mean, you can think it's frustrating to have to, to take so long to raise that kind of funding, but it also gives you time to really develop. And as long as you can get funding from company partnerships, it's really, I think, a great way to go.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to chat a little bit more about the IPD structure, and specifically how spinouts work. So I'm curious, does IPD take any equity, or does just UW hold some from the licensing structure?
Yeah, so the University of Washington has a formula for how revenues coming in to the university from spinouts come, and they don't go to institutes. So it would be split between the provost, the school, and the department.
Now, are past teams encouraged at all to give back to the IPD if they have successful exits?
Yes. So more recently, we've been asking spinouts to donate some small amount of equity to the IPD, and to the letter that has happened. But yeah, I think it's hard to people always talk about evergreening. It's hard to do in an academic institution, even if you were there was some of the trickle down. And very recently, the department has agreed that some share of it would come to the IPD. But that, I would say that the way that, and this is probably a general principle, that if you're developing technology and spinning out companies at an academic institution, it's probably unrealistic to think that you are going to, by the money coming back from those ventures, is going to help you keep going. Rather, I think you build goodwill and enthusiasm and excitement in the community, so it becomes easier to get resources in other ways. So I think it's just the way that I think most universities are set up, and maybe particularly public universities. It's just that the funds from companies just don't come back to institutes.
You're still writing plenty of grants.
Yeah, we're writing plenty of grants, so we write plenty of grants. But then the fact that we spun out companies, so ARPA-H is a big new and they're very interested in translation. So so when we write grants to entities like ARPA-H, they can say, well, look, these guys have a track record of actually getting things out. So I think starting companies, it's not like a financial win for the IPD, but it just helps. I mean, it's like it's an output.
What about funding from Rosetta licenses? So we'll come back to this, but Rosetta is largely free, as I understand it, to academics, but there are commercial licenses.
Yeah, well, so Dennis is here, and he can speak to this better than I can. But so what happens is the Rosetta licenses, licensing revenue, I think 20% or some percent comes back to Commotion, and the rest goes to the Rosetta Commons. So the Rosetta Commons is now a consortium of 80 institutions. And Dennis has done a very good job, so there's more and more revenue coming in. And so now, but that money is really now goes to a very large organization. And it's interesting, it's primarily used to fund summer programs for undergraduates and post-bac programs. So really, and with a particular emphasis on increasing diversity. So it's used not really to fund research, particularly not research at the IPD, but it's due to sort of improve the researching ecosystem.
Great, very important work. Okay, I'd love to get some relatively quick thoughts on a few sort of biotech startup tactics and strategies. So the first is founder-led biotechs versus outside experienced executives coming in. So some IPD spinouts have been scientific founder-led, and others have brought in experienced executives. And we chatted before, that's not mutually exclusive, but they can be slightly different paths. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on pros and cons of both.
Yes. Well, in a sense, the ideal thing is, and this happened with our Zeta, that you have a spin out where one of the scientific co-founders or more really would like to be a leader and has all the capabilities and talents that being a CEO requires. And so that has been very successful. There are other companies which have been very successful where the scientific founders felt they did not have those capabilities and were very excited to bring in an experienced manager as a CEO. So I think both can work. I think there's some interesting examples of Outpace is a company in Seattle that is led by two former postdocs from my group, Scott Boykin and Mark LaJoie, who were initially spun out of my lab as part of Lyle. And there they were scientists, and then they left Lyle, they spun out of Lyle, their own company, where they became the leaders. So I think really it can happen in all different ways.
Yeah, so you're seeing these like second generation startups now.
Yeah.
They're coming from the IPD.
Yeah.
It's exciting. Yeah. Okay, the next one is open source software versus protecting it so you can license it out. So again, I mean, we've talked about you had this vision from early on that Rosetta should be shared and open, but how do you suggest folks weigh those options?
Right, so we have two examples of that now with, so at the beginning when we started doing protein design, there were a couple other groups who were also doing protein design, but they had this idea, they were very interested in starting companies, and so they kept their code very, very closely held. Whereas, I was not thinking about starting companies then, and there were people leaving my group and getting faculty positions, and they wanted to keep working with it. So it was really great. Actually, the UW Tech Transfer came up. We came up with this idea of the Rosetta Commons, where the code could be communally developed, and then the revenue would flow back to everybody. I think one of the key ideas was that no one would ever get any money in their pocket from that, and that was really important because then, Rosetta, that code really spread around the world, and it was, it was basically what everybody used. Whereas the other codes that were held locally just couldn't go anywhere. So I think being open sharing of code is very good. Now Rosetta was free to academics, but pharmaceutical companies had to license, and they still do, and so that's what's brought in the revenue. With Rosetta Fold and RF Diffusion, we've just made them completely open source, and they also, like RF Diffusion and our other protein design codes like Protein MPNN have spread around the world, and they're pretty much the industry standard. In fact, I've been told that even companies that in principle have developed their own software are actually using our tools. So it doesn't really, I think in our space, making code freely available has been clearly the best thing. I could imagine there are other cases where having proprietary code is better, but I haven't come across those.
Okay, thank you. Okay, one more, platforms versus internal pipelines. So many biotechs, especially traditional therapeutics companies, have internal assets and pipelines, but others have platforms that they intend to create partnerships with other biotech, biopharma companies. What are your thoughts on those two
Well,
paths?
I think both can work, like A-Alpha, and
Yes.
David Younger's, company. I think it's a very successful platform company, and there are other companies which have a lead compound, and is what really very much Ingrid's path, that you push to the clinic as quickly as you can. So I think both models can be very successful. And then I think there's there's an interesting middle ground where you have a lead asset, but you also have a platform, and there it can take some art, and especially if you're dealing with venture capitalists who you want to keep your pipeline going, even though your platform development going, even though you have some hit, and they want all the money to go into development. So that's actually the situation for a number of the IPD startups.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. I want to come back to AI and life sciences, but broaden the question a little bit outside of just the protein design space, if you're open to that. So are there areas at the intersection of AI and biology or life sciences more broad, or computational biology or life sciences more broadly, that you think are underappreciated and just like ripe for innovation?
Well, I think the thing to look for is for AI methods to work, you need very high quality data, and you need a lot of it. And so the reason why first AlphaFold and RosettaFold and then RF diffusion have been so powerful and so transformative is because of the protein structure data bank, where really since the 70s, generations of scientists have put their careers into solving the structures of proteins, and billions of dollars went into that database, or are still going in. So there's this huge worldwide investment in determining the structures of proteins. And just to give people an idea of the scale of it, the protein databank has over 100,000 protein structures. For each structure, there are the X, Y, and Z coordinates of many thousands of atoms. So, and each one of those coordinates is very precisely known. So if you think about it that way, you have say 10,000 atoms times 100,000 structures. You have a billion atoms, and for each one you know X, Y, and Z. So you have billions of data points that are all really known absolutely precisely. And the problem is that so there are other examples where we have that kind of data. So images on the internet, easily that size or much bigger. Text on the internet. And so that's why we have, ChatGPT. That's why we have, DALL-E and stuff. But there aren't many places in biology where we have that much really, really accurate data. And so I think if you want to look at where the next transformation of AI in biology is going to happen, it's where is there either that kind of data already, or are there methods for generating it? So, so transcriptomics, for example.
Yeah. Another one in this broader space of AI and life sciences, are there areas at this intersection, we'll say in AI and life sciences or in healthcare, that you think should be regulated?
I think that there are different ways in which regulation can happen. There's regulation from outside, and there's regulation from inside. And in fact, I think just in the next day or two, we are going to put up some community guidelines on protein design and AI for protein design that have been forged with really the whole protein design community. And I think, and basically the idea is we believe that the methods should be open and shared because the potential to do good is far outweighs the dangers associated with them. But we will also have, and we're doing this already, to have, when new codes are released, to have a committee look at them to make sure that there's nothing dangerous there. But I think there is one of the biggest dangers. There's been a lot of discussion of biosecurity and AI, and one of the things that people don't often appreciate is a big danger of biosecurity is not so much the actual threat, but the possibility that we're actually seeing that companies will choose not to share what they're doing and using biosecurity as an excuse.
Yeah. One last question, and then we're going to open it up to audience questions. So when you and I chatted briefly last week, you mentioned that when you first came to UW, no VC firm was going to start a company in Seattle, and that has certainly changed. And I would love to hear your thoughts on as an ecosystem, as we continue to grow Seattle as a biotech startup, a bigger player in that space, how do you see the IPD's role in all of that?
Yeah, I think that is a place where we've played a role. I mean,
Yes,
it's true
absolutely.
when we first started companies, this was back, quite a number of years ago, and two of the main venture firms were Flagship and Third Rock, and I had many conversations with the principals there. They would come out to Seattle and talk, and we'd have these ideas of starting companies, and I would say, well, it has to be in Seattle if I'm going to be involved. And they said, well, we only do companies in Boston. And so things never went anywhere. There were quite a few different ideas that were percolated. But now that is no longer a problem. And so I think the ecosystem has been built up. I mean, like every time a company, an IPD company gets bought or something happens to it, 3 new companies arise on its ashes, and they just, it's kind of amazing. So there's so many companies starting. And then if you want to hire people who know how to do protein design, I mean, Seattle is definitely the best place. So I think you can kind of create an ecosystem just by, sustained activity.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the work that IPD has done. There is a microphone in the center aisle here. Yes, please just stand up and come to the, feel free to line up like you would do at a conference so we can keep the questions going. Emer, thank you.
Yeah. David, I feel privileged to be at the university because of you. And Jenny, what an amazing thing. Anyway, I love the fact that you said that you work on problems that really matter. Can you talk about any of the areas that you're working at, senescence, aging, and longevity, or aging biology, because there's so much we don't understand.
Right, and so actually there's an absolutely brilliant postdoc who is a world expert on aging, or postdoc candidate. He wants to come here to work on aging and protein design, and I think there the question really is, well, how do you apply protein design to aging? So it's something that we're thinking about right now. And there, like you said, the problem is that the biology is just not very well understood. So for problems like cancer and autoimmunity, there it's very clear what the mechanisms are. Whereas for aging, it's a little, we're a little limited by our understanding. So we're still trying to figure that one out.
I want to hear more about March 7th paper you were talking about. So
yeah.
I didn't quite hear what was the big breakthrough then.
Well, so in AlphaFold and RosettaFold, the basic primitives are amino acid residues. Mm-hmm. And you start with a collection of residues that's just kind of a random distribution. And during the prediction problem, it sort of gets organized into a 3-dimensional structure. Well, you start with an amino acid sequence. So maybe that's the simplest way to think about it.
Right. So
you start by knowing what the amino acids are and what their order in the chain is. And so and you can predict protein structures, the 3-dimensional structure of the protein, very accurately using that. But if the protein binds a small molecule or binds to DNA or is modified in some way, there's no way you can't model that with AlphaFold because it doesn't have any provision for inputting that information. Right. So in RosettaFold all atom, the new one, basically you represent the protein part of it in just the same way as a sequence of amino acids. And then but then for all the other parts of the system, you represent them as collections of atoms, and you just specify the bonded structure. So you specify what the atoms are and how they're connected, and then RosettaFold will now take that and generate a model that has not only the protein, but the small molecule or small molecules it binds to.
All right, very cool. Can you do like glycosylation?
Yes, so glycosylation is, we were actually very surprised that we could actually predict glycosylations accurately some fraction of the time because we thought they would be so flexible. But yeah, so any kind of modification to a protein.
Cool. Thank you.
I have a question from online. It's actually a 3-part, so I'll break it up. The first is I'd like to know from Jenny what she sees as the next 5 years of AI from her organization.
Ooh, I don't know if I can say what the next 5 years are. I think there's there's going to be lots of new advances, but I don't know if I can predict the next 5 years at all.
Okay, how about what challenges do you see from AI2? I'm sorry. What challenges do you see AI2 addressing?
Yeah, so as a research institute, I'll speak to them, although I don't know all of their research in detail. I'll talk to the incubator in a second. But as a research institute, they do a lot of core AI work. So they're thinking about common sense reasoning and computer vision and natural language processing, and continuing to push these forward alongside many other fantastic computer science researchers. On the incubator side, so the AI2 Incubator, a pre-seed startup incubator, all of our companies use AI at their core. A lot of what our companies are doing are leveraging advances in AI in specific verticals where you can solve end-to-end problems, and all of that at the end of the day is finding a pain point and fixing it. And I think some of the most successful companies are likely going to be ones that are doing things that just formerly we weren't able to do at all, as opposed to like, currently solve this problem doing X, and now instead we'll use generative AI. I think some of the biggest companies to come out of the AI2 Incubator and AI startups in general will be just getting into markets that weren't possible before.
And the third part of that is, are there any collaborations between IPD and AI2?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've actually connected some of your former students with AI2 researchers, but yeah.
This is a question for David. I told my mom I was coming to this talk. She used to work at Howard Hughes as a lab tech, and she said she remembers you as a postdoc, that you were like going around to labs to use their compute at nighttime when their computers were not in use. I'm assuming it's some sort of way to like overcome the computational bottleneck of protein design. Can you talk more about that? That sounds like a interesting anecdote.
Well, I can. Let's see. So we weren't the time when we really were hurting for compute was after I got here, and we started trying to predict protein structure from sequence, which was very computationally intensive. So we bought Linux boxes, and every closet we could find, we put one into, and there was at that time there was an undergraduate who said that they knew something about system administration. And then I got a letter from, it was the only time this has ever happened in my whole career at the University of Washington. I got a letter signed by the president, the provost, and every other important person at the university saying, clean up your act or else. And there were two problems. The first problem is that we were heating up the building we were in way too much. And the second is that every hacker who wanted to get into the University of Washington was getting in through our computer system, because we just kept getting more and more computers and stringing them together. I remember they were the Beatles, the first four computers we had. So we've gotten a little bit more, a little more professional since then. So.
There's a microphone. I have to walk up the runway. But this is a question for Dr. Baker. You had touched on the fact that we build these machine learning models and these AI models. We require a very deep data set for it. When it comes to things like the protein database, what are we missing? What are some things that you wish that data sets that we would be able to, that we don't have access to currently? Like what's our big gap, I guess is what I'm
That's a very good question. Well, there are two types of gaps, and this is a sort of a question of public good versus private profit. So one of those is that the structures we have a lot of structures of proteins in the protein data bank, but the majority of the structures of protein small molecule complexes, drug-like molecule complexes, are in the vaults of pharmaceutical companies. And so we spent a lot of time trying to work with a consortium of pharmaceutical companies to convince them that actually it would be a public good if they could make available their data just in sort of a federated learning way, in which they wouldn't have to give us their data, but our Rosetta Fold all atom that I was talking about could be trained, could go from one site to another effectively. That fell through. Similarly, pharmaceutical companies have a lot of structures of antibodies bound to protein targets. And I mentioned that we're now working on that problem, making progress, but having access to that data would make a big difference. But a more general answer is, while the structures of proteins, like the coordinates of the atoms, are well known, there are properties like the activity of proteins, like how strongly does a protein bind another protein, or how well does it catalyze a chemical reaction, which are not recorded or standardized in any kind of public database. So if you want to develop a deep learning model that predicts how strongly a drug compound is going to bind to your protein, that's hard, because while there's been a huge amount of data collected, it hasn't been curated or standardized. So that's an example of something where you would like to know not only what the structure of the protein is, but have quantitative data on its function, and that's much less well represented.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we're going to have to wrap things up there. Thank you, David, very much for being here. Thank you all for being here as well. And I think if we could please thank David.
And you did all the hard work, so you should get even more thanks than me.